My name is Beth Ferguson, and I am an implementation coach with Oregon Instruction and Intervention. And I am joined today by Lisa Lyon, who is going to introduce herself now and talk a little bit about decoding dyslexia.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. Good morning to everyone. And thanks to Beth and the rest of the Oregon ORTIi team for the opportunity to be included at this conference and to represent the parent voice. I have been involved with Decoding Dyslexia Oregon for about 10 years, and we've had the objective of improving the reading landscape for learners and their families, and also for educators. Recently, we have expanded our focus beyond dyslexia, since so many children are not being taught to read proficiently. We all know that all learners can benefit from evidence-based instruction that is best practice for learners with dyslexia. We also host monthly webinars for educators and families, and we hold events to connect students so they feel less alone. We also have hosted literacy summits for communities of color, and we know that schools want to improve their communication with families, and hopefully this discussion will help.
Yeah, so welcome. Oh, my slides just a little bit about us, about Oregon Instruction and Intervention, if you are not familiar with our work. So we are funded by a grant through the Oregon Department of Education to provide technical support to districts around the state of Oregon as they build, implement, and sustain multiple tiers of support primarily around reading instruction. We've done a little bit with math, but primarily it's about literacy and reading. And the reason that's kind of our task, right? But we really all are in this work because we believe that literacy is a civil right. And even as Marianne said yesterday, a human right. And that every child in every district under our watch really gets the instruction that they need and deserve every day in order to become a reader. But in order to do that, we also believe that every teacher has the right to the knowledge and skills and coaching and support, because, we're going to talk about this a little bit, but most of us were not trained well on how to teach reading. And so we want to make sure that everybody has what they need. So you'll notice that between our two organizations, we really have a very shared purpose. We're both advocating for improving systems of support around reading for students, for families and their caregivers, and for educators. So supporting across all of those levels so that every child can become a reader. The other person we'd like to welcome today is Sarah Thord. Our ORTIi team is very small, and in order to pull off a conference of this size, we need to bring in lots of friends to help. And so Sarah is here with us today, both as a friend of ORTIi, but also she is what I like to call the dyslexia person at the Oregon Department of Education. Sarah, your actual title is Early Language and Literacy Intervention Specialist. Is that right?
You got it. Yep.
Wrote that down. But you can just call her the dyslexia person.
That works.
She's kind of in the same business, right? Just making sure that students and families and teachers have what they need in order to teach all students how to read. So the purpose of today's session is to share with you some questions that lots of parents have asked when they see that their child is struggling with reading, and some of the responses that families have gotten. And some of these are things, well, most of them are questions that Lisa has gotten in her role as an advocate, and I'm sure Sarah has gotten. In fact, Sarah read through them and said she has gotten a lot of these similar questions, and they're questions that in talking to friends and family that they are wondering about. And some of the responses that we all kind of think, ooh, maybe that wasn't the best response given what we now know about how reading works. And so what we're going to hope to do is go through some of those responses and then brainstorm some improved responses based on what we now know about how reading works. And then this slide presentation will be a treasure trove of resources for you. We have loads of links to help you help support families. And really that the ultimate goal we all have is to improve communication between families and schools. what this session will not be. Okay, there are so many presenters at this conference who are giving us great instructional strategies, talking about the science of reading, talking about the science of teaching reading and learning to read. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. We're not going to talk a lot about different diagnostic assessments for dyslexia. What we are going to talk about, the focus of concerns from parents of these students, kind of if you think back to Nancy Young's reading ladder she talked about yesterday, about 60% or more of our students who do not learn to read effortlessly, and how we can better support better answer some of those concerns. So before we get started too much, I want to know who is in the room. Where are you from? Kind of what's your role in all of this? Are you a teacher? If so, what level? Reading specialists, special educators, whatever role as an educator? How about a parent of a struggling reader? Or are there multiple hats that you are wearing as you are coming to this? Thank you. So we've got teachers and parents, and that's such an interesting role, right? When you are a teacher and a parent of a struggling reader. Okay, so that actually is helpful for this next, for just giving you a moment to pause and think about really who is your why for being here, and think of a person you know. It might be a past student that you had. It might be a student that you have right now. It might be a family member or an adult friend you have who has struggled with reading for any length of time, really. And I'd like you to take a little sticky note, if you have one by your desk, and put that person's name on it. And just sort of keep it by your computer. And think of, as we're answering these questions, think about that person and how we can answer in ways that are kind and supportive and loving and honest, because that's what they would deserve. Okay, Lisa, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Beth. Yeah, as Beth said in her introduction, during the course of this session, we're going to examine questions that parents commonly ask teachers and principals with the goal of improving the responses. However, before we dive in, we want to brainstorm different influences, different reasons that influence our responses to the questions. So if you wouldn't mind, just put into the chat different ideas that may have restricted your responses in the past. What types of things might have limited or prevented you from giving an optimal response? We know there are barriers, and we also know that teachers want to do the best that they can for families, but we feel like it's important to examine these because there are restrictions, and we acknowledge that it can be a vulnerable situation to look at our own stuff that influences responses. Great. And then we have some pre-canned, so we'll see how ours compare. Great, not knowing what's happening in the classroom, not to use the word dyslexia, unaware of the facts, right, not being able to be specific, possibly afraid of parent reactions, teaching the parents to teach the students, our own experiences. Okay, I guess, do you want to start revealing some, Beth? These are some of the things that we talked about, we brainstormed in advance, how we came to learn to read ourselves. We think that plays into a lot of how our beliefs about how kids learn to read. What we were taught about how to teach reading, right? In our teacher prep programs. I have a degree in elementary and special ed, yet I didn't know the first thing about how to teach reading, and I couldn't recognize the signs of dyslexia in my own son. So what we were taught, if we weren't given that information, that's going to be difficult for us. Limited resources, right? Schools are maxed. Some schools don't have reading specialists. Another one is tradition, myths, and biases. There's a lot of bias, and we're going to look into that about reading, about working with other people. Myths, there's a lot of myths about how kids learn to read that really do a disservice when discussing reading. Yeah, what what restraints we might have given to us by the district, right? District policies. Yeah, and some schools, you know, I've seen responses where schools have said, do you really want to label your child? Do you really want your child to have a label? And from what I've seen, a lot of parents do want a label, not that they want it for a label, but they think that's a gateway to services. So, so I think educators and parents kind of differ there.
And I just wanted to add in here too, that as we were brainstorming and sharing the old responses that you're going to see here in a minute, and we shared these and got feedback from multiple educators, and pretty much all of us said, yeah, I probably have said some of those things in the past. And even now myself, I recognize that those weren't really rooted in fact, and I maybe should have given a different answer. So we want to make it really clear going through this that if you have said what we're calling old responses in the past, that's okay. We've done it too, right? So we're just kind of trying to reframe things and move past that now.
Okay, yeah, so here is a slide about different myths that we probably are all familiar with, but a lot of people think that kids learn to read differently, right? And we know from brain science that although the rate might be different, the process is the same. Some kids, you know, will come to read more easily than others. Another detrimental myth is that learning to read is a natural process. You know, since kids can learn to speak without direct instruction, some people have falsely made the same comparison with learning to read. And we know that's not true. Learning to read is a relatively new process in terms of human evolution. So that can be detrimental. Other things are poor strategies, like that kids should be encouraged to guess or use a picture. That is a myth that would be helpful. That is a myth that kind of gets in the way. And then the big favorite is that if you only read to your kid, they will become a good reader, right? We know that that's not true. That doesn't work for 60% of all learners. So these myths might have something to do with our responses. And then I want to just follow up on the bias question that we had on the previous slide. I want you all to just take a moment and think about learner's bias. Learner's bias, right, are the assumptions that we have about how we came to learn to read ourselves. And I want you to just take a minute and put into the chat, what percentage of educators do you think learn to read effortlessly or easily? 60%, 65, 80, 82, 60%. Okay, so well above 50%, 25%, okay, 45, 75%. So pretty much 50% and higher. Okay, you want to go and show the slide? Okay, this slide is from the Right to Read project. And so they surveyed nearly 3,000 educators. And you can see here a whopping 84% answered that they learned to read effortlessly or relatively easily in school. Okay, and then we can see out of nearly 3,000 people, only 61% who are teachers, or 61 teachers said that it was the most difficult skill that they had learned to do in school. So really, there's a huge bias up here about people who learn to read easily. And so we just want to take a minute and think about how that might impact us as educators, right? Is that going to be something that you would expect other learners to not struggle with? So that was just the point I wanted to make on that. Thank you. So this is a great quote by Kareem Weaver, who spoke yesterday. And why do we need to be aware of it? Learner's bias is the quietest, most insidious bias that's impacting our students. It's like humidity. You don't know it's there because you get used to it. So we just want to be mindful about if this is impacting our instruction. Another type of bias is implicit and explicit bias. Okay, these are quotes from Risha Conroy, who has founded the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children. And she has really done a great job about connecting the dots between implicit and explicit bias and responses that we give to children who are struggling to read and to their families. And so this is something that I want us to consider. Are there, do we have implicit bias with classes of people, with different races of people, with different cultures of people? And does that affect how we respond? My son, although it wasn't necessarily a race issue, you know, he was told to try harder. So we all know that things with race get more complicated, right? We all know that there's an overrepresentation of children of color in special ed and also receiving disciplinary actions. So we need to be mindful of this. And so she points out these behaviors or judgments, really, that that children have, you know, been called or told. Okay, and then this was really, this resonated very strongly with me. This is something that I had never thought of, but Risha talked about the implicit bias in the definition of dyslexia, that it requires an unexpected difference between intelligence and performance, right? But for an educator to suspect dyslexia, the educator must first expect that a child can be taught to read. And that was so powerful for me, because I had just assumed, you know, most educators really believe that 95% of all children can be taught to read. And so that really, anyway, that was unsettling to me, but I think that there could be something to that. And I just want to ask you all to sit with that.
Yeah, and I think once we're aware of all of these reasons why some of these previous answers that we have, what we're calling the old answers, once we're aware that they are not really the best answers anymore, it makes it a little bit hard. But then we have to think like, all right, now that we know better, we need to do that. But that also is our responsibility now with our new knowledge to help others with their responses as well. And honestly, a lot of us are just really getting into knowing more about how reading works. And so it's okay to not know. If a parent asks you a question and you're not sure of the answer, that's okay. A friend of mine said what she wished the high school teachers had said to her when she came with some concerns about reading is she wished they had said, instead of "he just needs to try harder," "I don't know, but I'm willing to learn more about how to support your child." And then it's also okay to say, "I'm not sure about this." Maybe you're not super fluent with the language of dyslexia or reading struggle at all. So it's okay to say, "I'm going to find out the answer to this and get back to you tomorrow." It's always okay to say that, except that time is of the essence. So getting back to families in a timely manner is important. Providing a plan and action in a timely manner is important, because as time goes on, we know that those reading difficulties get more and more entrenched. Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, yeah, so I've put together some categories of things that families want to hear from schools. Okay, families are really looking for validation. They don't want their concerns to be dismissed. You know, they want educators to say, "Oh, we can see why you're concerned. Tell us why you're concerned," to validate and to be taken seriously. Families also want to know how their learner compares to other learners, right? Because parents really don't know so much about reading acquisition, and so they have no metric to know like how serious this is or not serious. So any information that they could be given about how children do in general at that age would be useful for parents. And take time to educate parents. As we all know, learning to read is super complicated, and so anything that you can do to educate parents about it's not a natural process, and to normalize that learning to read is difficult. We've so often just thought that learning to read just happens through osmosis, but taking time to educate, and also that it's a phonological process, that it has to do with how the brain processes sound. would be helpful. And anything about a plan. What is the school going to do? And what can parents do at home? Parents want to be engaged and help. They want to do more than just read to their kids. So we have resources that schools can help send home with families. And also like the time check. How is this going to be monitored and when will I hear back?
All right. So the categories of questions, basically this first one is the I am worried category and can you help? And this is the one that, like Lisa just said, kind of comes up in the early years that people might be thinking, oh, it seems like my child is struggling. I'm not sure that he or she is taking to reading, or they might have another child who is older who seem to be reading a little bit easier, or sometimes even the opposite, that they have a younger child who is reading a little bit easier than the child that they're worried about. And so some of the old responses might have been, just wait, it's going to click, they'll get there. Or all kids learn at different times. Don't worry. The boys take longer. Your child has a late birthday. And then kind of these two behavior ones that are either positive or negative. They need to try harder. They're too fidgety. They don't sit still. Or the opposite one of, oh, but he or she is so sweet, such a hard worker, so kind to others, so cute, right? We've said some of those things. And then falling back on, are you reading at home? So what I'd like to think about now is what might be some strategies that we could, or some responses that we might come up with when we know better about how reading works, that might be better responses. And what I would like to add here is that if you're watching this as a recording later on, go ahead and stop and brainstorm some responses that you might be able to say now. If a parent of a young child, maybe early K3, let's say, comes to you and says, I'm worried, go ahead and unmute or put in the chat something that you're thinking of might be a more improved and proactive response. What do we got here?
Is there a history of learning disabilities in the family?
Okay.
Why are you worried? What are you seeing? What skills are missing? I hear your concern. Tell me more about what you notice. Awesome. Great suggestion. Happy to do a screener. Let's look more closely. Yeah, I've been monitoring your child's reading. Let's set up a time to discuss.
What was this last one?
Let's see. Happy to just let's look more closely. Ask for specifics. What is making them worried? Brainstorm. How to work with a parent. Thank them for pointing it out. Prepare in advance some tools that parents could take home and practice. Talk about how their student is doing in the classroom and concerns. Okay, great participation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. See, Lisa.
Yeah, and validation. I noticed the same struggles. Let's discuss.
Oh, okay. Let me put that one in because that's a really good one.
Let's discuss with a reading specialist. Even better.
Okay, sounds good. Well, those are great because they are very similar to the ones that Lisa and I kind of came up with on our own. And it really is about being specific. So saying things like the results of the screening and saying, you know, your child had this many words correct per minute. The goal is this, and really defining what the difference is and giving them validation that either way, right, that they're concerned, they have a legitimate reason to be concerned, and you are also concerned, and the data is showing concern also, or some reassurance like, well, actually they met the benchmark for now. We will keep track of this, and here are some other things we can continue to work on. And all of these things are really about also the plan, like what are we going to do and how are we all going to be part of this plan. I wanted to point out this one in particular about benchmarks, because sometimes that's really hard to answer, because it is true that some people have early birthdays, late birthdays. Some people are just a little bit slower to develop certain skills, but those benchmarks are set from years of data nationwide for that grade. And they really take into account all of those things. And they are very predictive of being able to be a successful reader, at least at the next benchmark, with good instruction. So we don't want to dismiss the benchmarks. And yes, we don't want to define a child by whether they, are on benchmark, below benchmark, well below benchmark, but those are there. They are an indicator, just like getting height and weight at the pediatrician, temperature at the pediatrician. All of those things are just benchmarks. They don't tell you everything about a child, but they are useful. And here are a whole bunch of resources, way more than you would want to look at right now. But I want to caution you, don't just send these resources home to families. These are tools for you to look at and find really specific things that families can help with. So for example, if you are talking about decodable texts or decodable words, there are some resources in here that you can send home. If you have been working on R control vowels, find some practice pages on R control vowels, send those home. Don't just say you should read more, but here's the exact skill that you can practice at home. And so there's loads of things on here to sort through. Okay, the second question comes into that category of how can I help if? And sometimes parents are unsure if they themselves have the capacity to help. So saying things like, what if I don't read well myself? Or what if I don't read in English? Or we speak another language at home? Some of our old responses, the same standby, just wait, it will click. As years go on, that one becomes really quite risky. Just wait, right? Or saying things like, we can't provide interventions to students who are ELs because of certain rules. Some of these things are older responses that we want to move past once we know better. So if you have families who come to you and say, I just don't think I can help because I'm not a good reader myself, or they're unsure of how to help because they speak another language, what are some things that you might, now that we know better and we do better and answer better, what are some things you might be able to say there?
Okay. Oh, great question. How does your child do with their first language? That gives us lots of clues with writing and reading. Okay, I can support you and give you tools. Can provide online resources. Help them with what they do know already. Reading directions, playing games, cooking, following cooking instructions. That's another good problem solving. Are there other members in the family that might be able to help? Ooh, someone's offering to help the parent learn strategies to help, which is great. Partner with your child and learn together. And then someone's talking about reaching out to community partners, a library. And then also making sure the vision has been checked.
Okay, those are some great responses. Again, thank you all for participating. We love it. So some of the ones that we kind of came up with, and this is my favorite that Lisa came up with on her own. Many reading difficulties are genetic and run in families. Since we know about your family history, we can spring into action. And she definitely used all caps on that one. So that's my favorite. It's a good one because I think that is a super important point, that if families are coming to you with their own struggles, it might mean that that genetic component is there. And then I want to point out some of the ones about biliteracy. And yesterday with Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, and also in her book that I keep by my computer all the time on literacy foundations for English learners, there are some great things in there to help support students who are biliterate and developing literacy skills in both languages, actually. And then the common warning signs of dyslexia can be in the first language as well. So really digging into those issues and finding out a little bit more. So then there were some other ways we can help with audiobooks, etc. And again, lots of resources on this page, but yesterday I know Elsa did talk about the MTSS for EL's website. And one of the things on this website is amazing. This Supporting Literacy at Home is a pamphlet that it's in multiple languages. It's not just in Spanish, it's a couple languages that give some tips for families on how they can support depending on their own level of English knowledge. And even if they don't speak English, how they can still support their child develop literacy. So that's a fabulous resource. Okay, Lisa, I believe this one is yours.
Okay, this is a frequent question that parents ask the school: is my child getting better with their reading? Okay, I'm not seeing any progress with my 5th grader. Can we discuss? Can I see the progress my child is making? Okay, we know sometimes schools can do better with communicating with families about the progress and what is happening. See, these are some of the old responses. Again, just wait, be patient. We know waiting is not a strategy. Pulling him out of his classes will make him feel bad. The reluctance to give the special help. That's the real challenging part, right? Because we don't want kids to have to miss their electives. Complimenting the child. Your son is amazing. He tries so hard. Let's see, your daughter, is not seem focused. And then again, are you reading at home? So let's see if you can come up with better, new and improved responses. Okay, great. Share the student's portfolio. Share the progress monitoring data to show the specific growth. Awesome. Compare similar assessments to show progress. Absolutely. Yeah, and then specifically saying, we use such and such as a universal screener and progress monitoring tool. So yeah, specifics are always good. Let's take a look and see what your child's data is telling us about their growth. And then here's a question perhaps we could discuss. What if focus is a major issue? So this is more of a question. Many students who have skills, but they have such inattention issues that it's interfering with their learning.
Yeah, I think that is so maybe that one, a good thing might be, well, let's work on 2 plans, right? Or we're going to work on a plan around behavior and a plan on on reading as well. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and reading fluency assessment done 3 times a year is great. Maybe more frequently if the learner is struggling. And then share what you've been working on, and then brainstorm what could be next. And a really great suggestion about involving the student, having them participate in what's going well for them and showing them growth. You know, Beth and I talked about, I shared some charts before when we were planning this that have like all the letter patterns, the graphemes and the syllable division rules on like a child-friendly graphic. And I think that's a big missing piece, is that the learners themselves are not seeing where they are in this on this timeline of learning. So anyway, that's a dream. If anyone out there is a graphic designer, I have samples that you could help develop.
She has some really beautiful ideas. They just need to have a graphic designer, because I think that's important. And it's, you know, we talk about quote unquote gamification of education, and that idea that when kids play a video game, they are all about mastering certain levels, right? And moving up. And if we can share with them specific, here's all the phonics skills, here's the ones, you know, this one's next, let's see if we can do it. Boom, we're done. You've mastered that one. That makes it a little bit easier, I think, for them.
Yeah, all the syllable types. It's great to. Okay, and so here are some of the responses that we came up with. Graphs, I love graphs. A lot of parents don't even know that there are standards for reading fluency. Hasbrook and Tyndall, you know, those, how does their child compare? So at least they have something to work towards, and also for kids to know. Some kids don't even know, and not that speed is the only issue, but it's good to have a benchmark, and then you can also track progress. Discuss the growth and accuracy and rate, and then talk about how frequently you do progress monitoring, and then come up with a schedule with the parent. How often do they want to see that? And it can be informal. It doesn't need to be, you know, a complicated report. It could be, Johnny did great with his silent E syllable types this week, or, have him practice a few high frequency words. Okay, here are the skills. I love the scope and sequence. I think that's really important if you have that, to show the progression. Offering to meet to discuss an adjustment to the plan, and then sharing grade level standards. Every state has, right, Sarah, grade level standards that are useful for parents to see. If it says write a 3-paragraph in first grade or second grade, and your kid is not able to write a sentence, that really will give parents an indication that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Do you want to say anything about the computer adaptive assessment?
Sure. Yeah, we've seen, and I know you've shared some examples where parents have said that they got data from some sort of computer adaptive assessment, and it's either hard to read, or it might not have actually assessed all of the skills, or even some of the times where it maybe wasn't given with much fidelity, like the test was read to them or whatever. And so really being able to say, if we're using this program, here are the skills the student has passed, here's what we're working on next. So those sorts of things. And there, again, lots of resources here about oral reading fluency in particular, but there's lots of things. Okay. So this one, what is your reading program for core? And I think this is an important one, because thanks to people like the work of Emily Hanford and social media and lots of other places, more and more people who are not in education are becoming more aware of what good reading instruction should look like. You may even have people saying, I've heard about the science of reading. Do you have that program for my child? Even though we know that the science of reading is not a program. And this question can be very tricky also if you know that the program that your district has adopted is maybe not in alignment with structured literacy, maybe not in alignment with what we know about good reading instruction. And so sometimes this can be a little bit hard to answer. Some of the old responses might be, this is our district adopted program, and if it's not a structured literacy one, we've been trained in this, and this is the one we're supposed to be using. And then having, those book boxes, look at all these beautiful texts. We just need to find the right book and your child will become a reader, right? We know that that's not true, but sometimes this is a hard question to answer. So when we know more about structured literacy, and I said we weren't going to spend a lot of time on this, so we won't, but it's knowing those elements of structured literacy and the principles of how we teach it. So how does your core reading program do that? And if it doesn't, that can be a little bit tricky for our response to families. So that can kind of inform our new answers, even if our program is not awesome. So when parents have questions about specific programs, and is it structured literacy? Is it the science of reading? What are some ways you can explain how you are teaching reading in the classroom for all students, but also for students who are struggling? So anybody have any ideas in this one? So pointing out the skills in the scope and sequence.
That's a good one. This is what my curriculum covers, and here's what I'm doing to supplement. So being aware of missing pieces. It's great. Yeah, and someone said it's okay to admit that all core programs have missing pieces, or strengths and weaknesses, I should say, sorry. We use blank as our district adopted program, but we also understand the limitations of a singular program. So we are using blank to reinforce. We could use parent support to get our district to consider broadening the instructional repertoire. Absolutely.
Oh, somebody's going to make me type that word.
Repertoire from the French. There you go.
We could use our parent support in the community.
Oh, it was auto-corrected in the chat, so you're not alone.
To encourage
better programming. How about that? Better.
Okay, I'm gonna, yes. You all know that the word was repertoire.
Right.
Or another word is menu, right? That we develop a menu of resources. Here's our core program, here's our supplements that everybody has been trained in, and that sort of thing. And so, so the ideal answer for this is our core program is blank. It aligns with structured literacy and is based on what decades of research. So science, and being really clear with families about what the science of reading is and isn't. Have taught us about how to teach children to read. Here are some examples of lessons of things that and also things that you may see in the room that help me teach reading, pointing out the difference between a predictable text and a decodable text, and how that's a decodable is more aligned with the science of teaching reading, sound spelling cards versus just an alphabet card, and really pointing out those things I think would be reassuring to families that their child is going to get the kind of instruction that they know is most effective. Another thing I was thinking is, if you really are not able to use other materials in your setting, you can say things like, our approved program is blank, but I have been meeting in small group where I'm using with your child, using more practices that are more aligned with structured literacy, and pointing those out as well. And then for students who are continuing to struggle with reading, especially in the upper grades, making sure that they have access to content across the day. So assuring them that a lot of essential content is read out loud, that the student has access to text to speech when necessary, and that we're reinforcing literacy all day long. And this is really important, regardless of what their official classification is, whether they have an IEP, whether they have a 504 or not. We need to make content accessible for them. So kind of the same question around intervention programs. So they might, their child might be receiving a reading intervention, and they might say something like, tell me about what's going to happen in that. Or one I think happens quite a lot is, I want my child to have, and then fill in the blank of the program that they've heard is good for students with dyslexia, that your district may or may not have adopted. And so some of our old responses might be like, yeah, I'm not really sure what happens. And I can tell you that my first couple of years teaching, that would have been my answer. I did not know when kids left my room to go to reading help. I had no idea what it was that they were getting. And then also, especially as we move up in the grades in special education classrooms, a lot of times the support is really just around helping them with classwork from other content areas, getting work done, help with homework, and it might not be a reading intervention program. So before we talk about a better answer here, let's talk about what we would want to see in a reading intervention program. So we really want to look for those, a highly effective program, kind of regardless of the brand name of it, but what elements are in it, those elements of structured literacy, the what and the how of what we're teaching. And we want to make sure, I love this graphic that Lisa found, that it's going to offer way more scaffolding, right? So what I like about this chart is they talk about kind of that explicit instruction in tier 1 might be the teacher doing an I do, and then we do, and then the student giving one try. Whereas as the tiers become more intense and the instruction more intense, that those opportunities for explicit instruction become even more targeted, more teacher examples, more doing it together with the teacher in pairs, and then more independent practice with loads and loads and loads of feedback and increasing intensity. And I know that Anita Archer has said multiple times that the best way to intensify an intervention is by offering more opportunities to respond and feedback. So that's kind of what this is getting at. And then this one, that increasing intensity across the tiers, knowing that your students who are struggling with reading, what is it that they're going to need in whole group and small group during core, explicit, systematic instruction, using, the big 5 or structured literacy, whatever you want, however you want to phrase it. In tier 2, ensuring those programs are even more explicit and systematic, and that they are targeted at those skills that the students are missing, probably off grade level skills, in a smaller group. So offering more opportunities to respond, more feedback. And then in the most intense intervention programs, and then across the day, how are we supporting students with even more explicit, even more systematic, even more targeted instruction to give them what they need in order to become a reader? So if we think about that, what we're looking for in our ideal additional layer of support for students, if a parent were to come and say, so what's happening when my child goes to this reading support? What might make a good answer? Okay, targeted to your child's need. And maybe even adding, we used diagnostic data to find out what they need. Okay. Anything else?
Let's see. They are receiving a reteach of essential skills or foundational skills that may need more support in. Great. Let me show you an outline of what we work on, or what we're working on. Yeah, and then again, the screener showed he or she was having difficulty with such and such. And this is an example of the activity that they are working on each day. And the other thing that I think as a parent would be useful is, now with the COVID experience that we've all been through. When I started looking into Orton Gillingham for my son, I remember Googling, what the heck does it look like 10 years ago? You couldn't find anything, any examples of direct explicit instruction. And now there's so many, Reading Rockets, University of Florida Literacy Institute. I mean, there would be nothing wrong with sending home a snippet about this is actually what direct explicit instruction looks like. And because parents can do it too, even with the spelling, segmenting into sounds, finger spelling, and then making the sounds as they write. There's so many ways that parents can support if time is taken, as someone said previously, to educate parents about how they can help at home.
Something interesting that came up yesterday with Nancy Young was she said I don't know if any of you were in that one. She said something about inviting parents to come watch the intervention. And I think that would be a little tricky privacy wise, maybe. But if you had if you could possibly do some sort of open house type thing, and all the families of those kids who were in that group came together and could see this is what is different about this intervention. It's a small group. I mean, if my kid were a struggling reader and I were able to see that, I'd be like, whoa, this is really great. And I think I could try some of these things at home. So I thought that was a great thing that she shared yesterday. So some of the things we talked about in our own brainstorming was just talking about that intervention menu that your school setting has, and talk about which intervention programs are less intense, which intervention programs are more intense, and then talking about how you use those diagnostic assessments to really determine what the best match for them was, how much time it was going to be, what are the elements of structured literacy in that program. Because a lot of times I think when people come asking for a program by name, they're really saying, somebody told me this is the one, when really it's those attributes of those programs in structured literacy are the magic pieces. It reminded me yesterday thinking about if you saw an advertisement for a certain medication on TV and you're like, oh, go into my doctor, I'm going to ask for that pill. And the doctor might say, well, this is what the pill does. This is how it's going to work in you, etc. Here's something that is very, very similar, but doesn't, we can actually access it, because a lot of times you can't access all the programs. And if they come and ask for a program by name that no one in your district has been trained in, that program's probably not going to be effective if the teachers haven't had training in it. And then also sharing with the parent how you are helping them with extra instruction across the day, how you talked about it at your individual problem solving meetings. All right, this is your favorite topic.
Okay, I think I drew the short straw when we were giving out assignments. Okay, very difficult question. What is your secondary support, reading support at the secondary level? Okay, there's been such a huge emphasis on getting kids learning to read in K-2, and then it switches over reading to learn in 3rd grade and up. But what if that child has been passed along and is in middle school or high school without those foundational skills? We really don't have, in my opinion, many reading specialists, right, at the middle school and high school level. Or in high school, if a kid is on an IEP, then they have to take a study hall and are not really getting direct explicit instruction. Okay, I diverted, sorry, you got me started. We really don't teach reading to high schoolers. We support students with reading to learn, not learning to read, and we can provide accommodations, okay? How can we do better for these learners? We need your help. Maybe great things are going on at your school. Please share. Actually, I can share a short story about a district in Gladstone, and I've just been contacted by a middle school reading specialist, and they've reconfigured their schedule, their daily schedule, to have 7 periods. So now each child can take an elective, and if they need to, they can get reading help. She can work with 60 children a day, 6 periods, 10 students in each slot. So that's creative problem solving. Okay, we're seeing self-advocacy, having students reach out and ask for support. Yeah, Anita Archer's rewards program is great. Offering push-in from reading interventionists. Make sure there's someone who can support them at higher grades. Important topic.
All right. And I'm glad we have some things on here because we kind of came up with basically what we thought were the ideal responses, knowing that there weren't a lot out there. So did you want to talk about this one at all, Lisa, or do you want to just move on?
I think we could just move on. Did we talk about like morphology, would be great for kids and syllable types at that level. And also, again, accessing content, making sure that learners have access to audio that's commensurate with their grade level. So they're not missing out on that content if they're struggling learners.
Yeah, and I will add that this quote down at the bottom from Anita came from a meeting earlier this year. And I think, Sarah, you were also there with IDA. And she kind of talked about this balance that you need to, yes, you do need to accommodate to make sure they're getting content, continuing to build those grade level skills and vocabulary and all of that, but also don't miss out on the opportunity to continue to teach reading, because it's that accommodating and it's also liberating them. And we know that even adults who have had a lifetime of dyslexia and can be taught to read with the right intensification of reading instruction. So we don't want to just give up by the time we get to secondary and say, well, I guess we're just going to do accommodations, but we want to continue both of those things. Okay, lots of materials here. I'm going to kind of keep going. All right.
Okay, yes. So a lot of families ask, is it dyslexia? Could my child have dyslexia? And some of the things that they see is the common confusion with B's and D's, reading and writing. And so they want to have their child evaluated for dyslexia. Old responses, just wait. Waiting is not helpful. We can't use that word, dyslexia. We don't test for dyslexia. Or do you really want your child to have a label? So let's see if what you can brainstorm for improved responses to this question.
Somebody put in here, yeah, that idea they wished that special ed teachers could screen. Interesting. Yep.
Oh, can we? So repeating the question is, parents might ask the school, or what can the child be diagnosed with dyslexia, evaluated for dyslexia? Blah. Tongue-tied.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people, even in meetings in the last 2 months, I've had even teachers say to me, I think it might be dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
And then telling parents that they should go get outside testing. Because that's expensive. All right, any improved thoughts in here?
Yeah, so a response, you could validate B's and D's and say, yeah, reversing letters is developmentally appropriate in younger children. That's not necessarily an indicator of dyslexia. Someone suggested sharing with the parent that they use the RAS assessment for students from K to 2nd grade. And then you'd have to explain that to the parents, right? Like, why is that important? What does that tell us? How does that impact reading, the rapid automatized naming? How, if kids have a phonological deficit, they may also have that RAN deficit. So then that would be like a double deficit. Let's see, what else do we have? the SIM model, strategies and intervention model. Yep. Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Might have you ask you to present on that for us.
Oh, yeah, I think that was that for this part or the last slide?
Yale Center for Dyslexia has a good checklist, symptoms based on age. I know NCIL, National Center for Improving Literacy, just came out with a new chart. Explain what is normal in reading and writing in the child's development, focus on the strengths. Explain what dyslexia is. Yeah, it's so pervasively misunderstood. Yeah, all good. Yeah, and again, asking if there's a history of dyslexia or difficulty learning to read in the family, because some people, a lot of older folks have not been diagnosed.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And I think we kind of covered, we were going to talk about this one. Tell a little more about why you want to know if your child has dyslexia. I put an asterisk there because I didn't want people to read this with like a teacher voice, like, why do you want to know? But really, why is it important for you to know? And did you want to talk about that one, Lisa, a little bit?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when parents reach out to me and say that they want their child to be evaluated for dyslexia, I ask them why. And a lot of times they incorrectly believe that if there's a diagnosis for their child's troubles, that they will get remediation. So I try to say, it's a long process, and that might not be the case. That might not make the school any better equipped to serve you or your child. And
yeah, and I think there are so many myths about it. And when people don't understand what a diagnosis is and isn't, what intervention programs can and can't do, and things like that. So, one of the things, this bullet point further down is, even if your child is evaluated for dyslexia, and our school district may or may not assign that label of dyslexia for your learner. And I know there is some misunderstandings out there, whether or not that word can be used in an IEP. But there are also other categories that you can qualify for an IEP. And often with dyslexia, it's called specific learning disability in the area of reading. And in all of these cases, it is my passion and belief and the work of our project that you shouldn't need a diagnosis to get the instruction that you need and deserve to become a reader. Now, that said, school is in a real life place, and schools have real life budgets, and they have real life personnel, and they have real life access to training. So what does it mean to have an official diagnosis? It's complicated, right? And I think that's where you live. Well, both you and Sarah probably live in that complicated place.
Yeah, and parents just want their child to be taught to read.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if schools can say that, and some parents are unaware that the best practice for kids with dyslexia is really the best practice for all learners. And if that's already happening, then that, if explaining that to parents, that can make them more accepting of just having their kids taught and improved. That's helpful.
And I think another important thing to say is getting a diagnosis, whether it's outside or inside the school system, of dyslexia does not remove the responsibility from anybody to ensure that the reading instruction still happens. Having this diagnosis doesn't mean we give up on teaching the child to read. It just means it's going to be a little harder or a lot harder, right? Depending on the level of difficulty. So we don't want to give up.
Yeah,
and maybe we've got a label, we don't need to work on this anymore.
And maybe one point I did want to make is, when parents ask if they're to have their kid evaluated for dyslexia, frequently schools might just shut that conversation down and say, we don't do that. And it becomes an argument of semantics, as opposed to what the family really is asking is, my child is having difficulty learning to read. How do we investigate that? Asking for a special ed evaluation. about difficulties related to reading. And if the parents use the wrong terminology, that's not helpful. So, and lots of time can be lost arguing back and forth. And so try to, entertain what is the parent really asking? They want the reading issues to be resolved.
That's basically the bottom line. Yep. Okay. Let me go to the next. Now we are officially over time, but we will keep on trudging on. There are multiple resources on this page, some things about reversals, a really great video about what is dyslexia, some myths about dyslexia, all great things. So question 8, we don't have a lot of responses for, but this is a discussion and why I'm glad Sarah's here in case there's questions. So what about the law? And depending on where you're coming from in the country, your state may have different laws around dyslexia, but in Oregon, we do have a law. So when people say, I heard that there's a law about dyslexia, didn't Oregon pass laws saying schools are supposed to do something? I like that term, do something about dyslexia. And so some of our gut responses might be, yep, we screened in kindergarten. That's what the law says. And your child wasn't flagged then. So we're fine. Or we screened, your child may have some indicators of risk, but I think somebody else takes care of that. That's not me. I'm not the dyslexia person. The tricky thing is the law does mandate screening. It doesn't necessarily mandate interventions at this point. So there is a link to the guidance for the law in Oregon, but basically it kind of hinges on this, that at least one teacher in every school receives some training related to dyslexia. And these are kind of the components that training needs to have. And I know Sarah is on top of these things and looking at programs all the time to see if they are in line with the law. But the law doesn't necessarily say that all teachers need to know this. It's basically one teacher. It's not a train the trainer model. And so some of us who are in classrooms and didn't get this specific dyslexia training may not know even anything about the knowledge and practice standards, may not know about best instruction for students who are struggling with reading. And so that's the really tricky place. And instead of coming up with new responses for this, Sarah, you're the one who shared this with me, this really great document from CORE that came out kind of, I think, around the same time as the law, that really reflects best practices for these guidelines about students with dyslexia, but not all the pieces on this infographic, and it's 2 pages long, so we'll look at both pages. Not all of these are written into the law. Some of them are just best practices. So our hope is that if you would be able to explain all of these things to families, or if not, who can you go to in your school or setting or district to be able to say, so what does this look like in our setting? So the law says, yep, you have to screen. Does the law specifically say we need to intervene?
It's a little bit tricky the way it's worded as I'm coming in and noticing that like the addition of an or a but when we're talking about statute and administrative rule can really make a difference. And so what it does say is that once we screen students, we monitor their progress. And if they have not demonstrated improvement by that next screening window, that's when we start to reach out and dig into family history and really start to get serious about developing a plan. What that doesn't really include in that space is that intervention piece.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say you have to intervene using structured literacy, teaching explicitly and systematically in these foundational skills. We're just looking for that growth as marked by that universal screening and progress monitoring piece. Now, what we know about students improving and demonstrating growth on those assessment tools is that it usually requires systematic and explicit intervention. So if we're expecting growth, we have to be thinking about what are we doing in those interim times, and that comes down to intervention.
Right. And what are we doing differently for these kids who have kind of been identified that we're not doing for every single kid because they had a little bit more risk than everyone else. Yeah, that is really tricky. And that part's not necessarily there. And then the other piece that's interesting to me is number 2, where universal screening isn't necessarily mandated beyond kindergarten and first grade. And for first grade, it's just for kids who've moved in. So there are a lot of students who could be missed in this initial screening. There are a lot of compensatory strategies that kids often use to be able to memorize words, for example, that you might not notice their difficulties until later on. So that's why we really encourage require that the districts we work with screen through all of elementary school. And then it's that support model. We're screening, we're providing interventions, we're checking to see if it's working, and we're adjusting our plan if it didn't work. And then also is all of our instruction based in these elements of structured literacy? If it's not, like Sarah said, can we really expect growth? That would be a little harder to see. That required training for teachers. Is it enough in a school to just have one person trained on this? Or is it probably better to have most teachers who are in front of students have this knowledge about foundational skills and adapting to what students' needs are? And then the other part on this infographic that is great is that there are state guidelines for dyslexia training. And so there's lots of opportunities that people have to be able to get training. Some are low cost, some are high cost, and that's the part that's tricky. And you have to be a pretty wise consumer of what's out there. What I appreciate, Sarah, is that on your side, at least, some of these things have been vetted. So, well, all of them have been vetted. So thank you for that. Is anything else you want to say about the law? Are we good?
No, I really appreciate the distinction between what's required and what's best practice, because it doesn't, that kindergarten only screening, with the exception of those few first graders, doesn't feel like it goes far enough. And what I will tell you that I'm starting to hear more and more and more from schools and districts and ESDs and practitioners is that, especially post-COVID, as we're looking at lots of kids not where we want them to be right now, we're seeing schools and districts expand that screening beyond what is required. And that's really what I want the message to be, is we have this little compliance piece around dyslexia, but we really need to go much further than compliance. And we need to go further than compliance, not because it's rooted in compliance, but because it's rooted in best practice. And that idea of early identification and intervention can avoid so many of these challenging parent questions that come to us. If we're really diving in deeply with early identification and early intervention, we're reducing the chances that we have those secondary families reaching out to us saying, oh my goodness, my student isn't where they need to be. What help is available? Because we would have caught on to that much sooner, and we really could change the trajectory for kids. So early, go above and beyond the requirement, because it is rooted in best practice. That's my big message. And the last thing I'll say is, in terms of the dyslexia specialist that is housed in each K-5 school, we really, if the law works the way that it should, and we've sort of built in the system to have a resident expert housed at each school site, we really want to make sure that that person, number one, people know who that person is. If you're a teacher in a K-5 school, do you know who your trained K-5 person is in your building? As a parent, how do we communicate that? We also have to make sure that we understand that that person is not necessarily going to have the capacity to be the person providing the instruction for all students that need it. They really need to have that time to be the consultant, to be present at some IEP meetings, for example, or IPS meetings, so that they're bringing that specific knowledge that they've got in these required areas, and can really apply that. But we do find that we don't have a lot of knowledge at the school and local level about who that person is. And so that's something I would challenge schools and districts to think through.
Yeah, that's helpful, because in a lot of places where there hasn't been a lot of training about reading or how to read data, or even what the purpose of the screening data is, I think that can be challenging. So thanks Thanks,
Yeah.
Sarah.
The other thing that people are going above and beyond, though, is also on this. And I'm hearing from districts saying, oh, we didn't train just one teacher, we trained 14, and if there's capacity to do that's fantastic.
Yep, because the more people who are in front of kids who understand this, the better. It always comes down to somebody should do something. And to me, there should be lots of somebody's doing something. Okay, so Lisa, super fast, what is it that families want and need?
Yeah, so they just want to be heard. They want to be thought of as partners. They want to have good information. They want honesty. They want a plan that's communicated to them. And I guess that's kind of it.
Yeah, thank you. I think we got at most of those things. And then the question is, how do we systematize this, right? How do we make sure that those of you who are at this session today, you now have some of these better responses. You have this knowledge from being at this conference about evidence-based practices and how to teach reading and what's effective, what's not effective. How do we make sure we systematize that? And some ways to do that based our assessment and instruction in those evidence-based practices. How are we as a system communicating objective assessment information to families, not just a teacher in this room or a teacher in this room, but that expectation that we all are sharing in a similar way. And when there's a struggle, how do we make a plan with families and keep them informed? What's written basically in our district standards of practice to ensure that this is happening in every classroom? And how are we communicating with families about the outcome, if the plan is working or if it's not? Do we have those communication structures built in system wide so that what a kid is getting in Mrs. So-and-so's class is similar to the communication that's happening in Mr. Such and Such's class? And how do we know if we are communicating well? So these are things we want to know both district wide. How do our parents feel about our literacy instruction district wide, but especially those families of the students who are struggling? How is this information getting to them? Is it what they need? Do they need more? Like, ultimately, Lisa, sorry, we want to put you out of business. We want to make sure that nobody needs an advocate.
That's what we want.
And that, because I know you're making big bucks at this, right? We want to make sure that every family feels secure in the knowledge of how their student is being supported. I copied this directly from Anita today. Took it out of the folder and put it in our presentation. So just having those checklists in our district, how are we ensuring all of these things happen? And she had one about vocabulary too. So I encourage you to go back to that, but it shouldn't just be about my classroom. It should be system-wide, all of these things. So how do you move your system forward if you are one of these people and the whole system is not doing things? How do you advocate for change? And it really is kind of depends on your role and where you have power, but really try to find those allies within your system who can help drive change. If you are a classroom teacher, ask your principal, can I start implementing some of these things that are rooted in structured literacy, at least in small groups, and then I'll share my data with you, how it's working. As district leaders, how are we advocating for change across entire systems? And then Lisa said this before, that as a parent, how are we pushing for change in our systems? Again, loads and loads of resources. There are some things on here. I'm a huge podcast fan, love all of these. This open source phonics is really nice. If your program doesn't have explicit systematic phonics instruction and materials, there's some open source stuff here that is wonderful, and parents can access it, tutors can access it. This 6 shifts downloads is about shifting from balanced literacy to structured literacy. I would not advise all of the things, so be a wise consumer of what you find at that website. And I think we were hoping to have time to let people put some other resources in, but since this file or since this presentation is in the file, if you think of things, you can add them to that or send one of us an email. And here are our emails. Thank you for sticking with us. I know this was a little wonky and a little long. Hopefully it was valuable. Thank you for your feedback and have a wonderful afternoon.